sounds good. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to speak to you, despite the slight kerfuffles that we've had. Yeah, everyone, say hello to Josh. I'm just adjusting the audio, by the way. Yeah, so Josh is a professor of economics, and I'm excited to speak to him because we've obviously kind of followed each other's work and followed each other on Twitter and everything for quite a while. And I'd say you've been quite a big influence on me. I really like a lot of your work, and I'm hoping to talk about as much of it as possible today. So yeah, I'm really, really excited to speak to you.
Great. Well, I'm happy to be here.
Cool. So your analysis is broadly quite Marxist, I think, but it's also quite contemporary. So there's a lot of like your own thinking added, and I think one of the articles that I really, really like of yours was actually like a kind of critique of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which was released, I think, a year or two after the book. And in this, you critiqued Piketty's idea of capital and how he models capital as basically incoherent. And you put forward a view of capital and inequality, which was more based on bargaining power. So could you talk us through your framework and how it relates to Piketty's?
Right. Well, Piketty's framework, and it's really not in any way distinctive to him. He adopted a very conventional mainstream framework, and we can perhaps discuss later how much it's shared by Marx or some Marxists. But in any case, in this framework, we think of capital as a kind of physical substance, a quantity of stuff. And of course, the thing about capital is that it can be used to produce more stuff, and the owner of the capital is going to get some sort of a claim on the stuff that capital produces. That's sort of our naive notion of what capital is. This comes out in the mainstream through some notion of production function. The great Keynesian economist Axel Leinufeld compared it to like a stew, a bouillabaisse, where you throw in all the ingredients, you wait a while, and the stew comes out. So capital is this quantity of stuff. We can measure it and think of it as some physical thing that makes more stuff. And of course, the owners of the capital get that additional stuff. And so the story here is essentially that the owners of capital claim the product of that capital, and they consume some of it themselves, but largely because they are capitalists, they reinvest it, they save it and convert it into more capital, which of course produces more stuff, which they then save and convert into more capital. And, in the sort of mainstream view, this process comes to some sort of natural stopping point where the capital is mostly just replacing the old capital, and you get a stable sort of ratio of capital to labor and a stable share of income going to the owners of the capital and the owners of the labor. But Piketty's sort of innovation was to suggest that actually, for various reasons, this process can continue for a long time or perhaps indefinitely, with the quantity of capital rising relative to the amount of income in society and the share of that income going to the owners of the capital rising. And that this is sort of a natural organic process that just happens through the product of capital being saved, reinvested, and converted into more capital. So again, I think to many people, this is a very natural and intuitive way of thinking about what happens. But the interesting thing is, if you look at Piketty, the wonderful thing about Piketty is the data that he's collected mainly from various national tax records going back quite a long ways, and done an enormous amount of work, him and his collaborators, to make that sort of comparable across countries, and then to share it with anybody who wants to use it. It's a tremendous service to social science, which I think is really, really admirable in that respect. And so you can look at the data and you can ask a simple question, which is, how much of the increase in the measured stock of capital, which of course we measure, and this is the critical thing, in dollars. We don't have any other units for measuring capital. We have buildings, we can count up square feet. We have land, of course, we can count in a similar way. We have machines. If you have similar machines, you can count how many of them you have, or perhaps if it's a electrical generators, how many units of megawatts or whatever. But we can't compare all these different things with each other and come up with one number except in terms of dollars. So we have all this capital we've measured in dollars. We can ask how much of the change in that capital, that quantity of capital over time, is explained by the saving and investment. So at one period of time, we might say, there's so many $1 trillion of capital at market value in the United States. Then there's a time passes, there's investment, there's depreciation, whatever we can say about that, the wearing out of old machines. And then at a later time, we measure the amount of capital, again, in dollars. Now, if capital was really a fluid, if it was a substance, if it had a sort of physical interpretation, we should find that by and large, the change in the capital stock over time kind of lines up with the amount of new investment minus whatever we think was the depreciation, the wearing out of old capital. Of course, it won't be exact. There's always all sorts of measurement issues and so on. But we should see by and large, that's what's happening. The more investment there is, the faster the increase in the capital stock. But if you look at Piketty's data, the interesting thing is it's not true at all. There's essentially no relationship between the change in the capital stock over time and the flows of investment into that stock. Or if you look across countries, and you ask, did the countries that saw the bigger increase in their measured capital, measured in terms of dollars, were they the ones that had a larger flow of investment, relative to the size of their starting capital stock? And the answer is no. There's really, again, no real relationship at all. So, this mental model that people have, which is sort of like a bathtub, you've got a certain amount of capital in the tub. When you invest, you're pouring more in. A bit's always draining out or evaporating through depreciation. And then over time, those flows kind of balance out and you get a certain amount in the tub. Well, it doesn't look like that. The amount of capital in the tub seems to be going up and down for reasons that really have nothing to do with any of the flows we can observe. And that suggests that it really doesn't make sense to think about capital as sort of a quantity of stuff. And so, my suggestion, and I'm not the only one who's had this thought, my friend Suresh Naidu, has made a very similar argument, and other folks have as well, is that, Piketty has really got the logical structure of this thing backward. Piketty and the mainstream people are going to say there's a certain quantity of capital that produces a certain amount of additional output. Using those machines allows us to produce a certain amount of more stuff. And because we have the structure of, relationships, social relationships, claims of property and ownership that we have, the additional stuff produced by the capital goes to a group of people who own that capital. And that they collect that stuff, which we can then measure as income. So first you have a quantity of capital, then it produces an amount of income. But the reality is really the other way around. You have a flow of income that comes first. And that's then converted into a stock based on how much people value that income or value the expectation of getting that income in the future. So, and this is most obvious if you talk about, let's say, land. The value of land goes up and down. In recent times, it's tended to go up a lot. If you look at the increase in measured wealth, measured capital in the US and a lot of other advanced countries, a huge part of that is an increase in the value of land. Well, that's not, the increase in the aggregate value of land is not happening because more land is being produced. It's not, landlords are saving up their rents and then using that to produce more land. It's just that the existing land is becoming more valuable. So if we think, okay, what's actually happening here is you have a claim on income first. You're receiving an income and expect to receive it in the future. And then we put a market value on that. And that is the value, the stock of capital. It's not behaving like a physical quantity at all. So there's no savings that was necessary, and there's no tendency for investment to secularly increase the stock of capital and secularly increase the share of income going to the owners of capital. Instead, we should start from the other side. If we really want to understand these historical phenomena, we should say, what are the social processes that lead the product, our collective, efforts to be divided up among various groups, workers, owners of capital, and whoever else. And then, after that fundamental division happens, then some market value, which depends on, expectations, animal spirits, or financial factors, then leads capitalists to put a value on the stock of claims that they believe they're going to get in the future. But the distribution happens first, and the quantity of capital is derivative of that, whereas in Piketty's story, the quantity comes first, and then that produces a distribution. Now, I should say, this is a critique of a lot of the arguments you find in Capital in the 21st Century, and perhaps even more so in some of the academic, scholarly work that Piketty was doing around the time and somewhat before he wrote that book. If you look at his more recent work, to me, it sounds a lot more like the story that I'm telling. He emphasizes politics of distribution a lot more, and this sort of mechanical process of accumulation practically, in some of his recent papers, disappears from the story, or it ends up being just one little factor that goes in a footnote somewhere. But yeah, the essence of it is, and the point is not, this is not a first principles argument. It's not saying, we can't ever think of capital as a quantity of stuff. It's just saying that if you look at the evidence, if you look at the numbers that he actually presents, it doesn't behave like a quantity of stuff.
Yeah, and I think, one of the simplest ways to show this disparity, right, and you did mention this, but just to hammer the point home for everybody, is to look at when you've had big changes in the valuation of capital because of political dynamics, and there's obviously been no physical change. Right, so the example that I think you gave that really hit it home for me, you were talking about land, but also you gave the example of the end of slavery, right? So
that's right.
There was a whole bunch of capital value that was just a product of ownership of people. Once that institution was abolished, the capital value disappeared, but the people were still there, right?
Right, that's exactly right. You had a claim on people's labor, on people, a very extensive and, kind of horrifyingly extensive claim on all of these people's capabilities that could then be expressed in money terms. You got an income from owning slaves, and of course the value of the slave was capitalized. And, there's interesting, kind of as an aside, there's a great the economic historian Gavin Wright, he wrote a fabulous book called The Political Economy of the Cotton South. You might have seen, but he really emphasizes how much the sort of political economy of the South and the politics of the South were shaped by the fact that you had people's wealth that was embodied in the capitalized income that they would get from slave ownership. So that there was a sense in which they were actually rationally frightened by any sort of political weakening of the hold of slavery in the country, because it reduced the value of their assets. So they were sort of capitalizing into their wealth whatever might happen in the future to the institution of slavery. But the important thing for our purposes, as you say, when that went away, it didn't mean that people were any less productive. It didn't mean any real resources had been destroyed, but it meant that flow of income was no longer something that you could put a market value on. If the slaves are using their own labor, maybe to meet their own needs, or maybe they're still selling it as wages, either way, there's no longer a property right that can be traded and capitalized in that way. So what's happened is not a change in the productive capacity of society. What's happened is a change in the flows of income that you can put a market value on and trade. So, Piketty talks about this, it's in his book, but he treats it as sort of an aside, an exception. And my suggestion is we should think of that as really a representative, a typical story of changes in capital over time. Another example, the big shift towards a more egalitarian distribution of income happens in the middle of the 20th century and really around World War II. And people sometimes say, oh, well, that's because of all the physical destruction of capital that happens during the war. So that's, if you have this model of capital as a quantity of stuff, and then that produces an income, then of course, less stuff, less income for the capitalist, more quality. Totally wrong. First of all, obviously, the shift towards a more egalitarian distribution of income was just as large in the United States or Canada, countries that were completely untouched by any sort of physical destruction from the war, where in fact the capital stock at the end of the war, to the extent we can measure it in a consistent way, was much bigger than the capital stock at the beginning of the war. And even in Europe, the countries that were hardest hit by the war, there was actually a tremendous investment. What's his name? Economic historian wrote. I'm blanking on the name, points out that actually, if you measure certain sort of concrete things like quantity of machine tools, Germany had more at the end of the war, despite the enormous devastation, than at the beginning. So it wasn't physical destruction. It was the breakdown of a lot of the sort of political institutions and relations of coercion and hierarchy that had maintained the ability of capitalists to claim incomes. And then also, the super full employment in countries like the United States that weren't touched by the war, that just drastically shifted bargaining power in favor of labor and against capital. And also, of course, the expansion of the state, which was required to fight the war, but then created an opening for new kinds of political power that could be, mobilized by the working majority of the country that hadn't existed before. So these are social changes in the distribution of income that led to this drastic shift of income from capital to labor that have nothing to do with any sort of physical change in any kind of stock of capital imagined as a quantity of some kind of substance.
Yeah, so I think yeah, I mean, just so I want to say one thing because you mentioned Piketty a little bit ago. Piketty, the guy, and he, I think he did seem to kind of convert to to this point of view, maybe partly as a result of your review and also Suresh Naidu's chapter in After Piketty, because I remember he said that he agreed with basically the view that you're putting forth, and it makes sense of Capital, doesn't it? Because the in part 3 of Piketty's book, there's a whole section about all the stuff you've been talking about, right? Political dynamics, unions, shareholder capitalism, how we organize the economy, right? But I think what you were saying is, while you basically agree with what's in there, it seemed like a bit of a non sequitur from the earlier analytical part. And I think what this point of view of Capital as just a claim on wealth, as a claim on the present discounted future value of wealth, that kind of coheres Piketty's framework much better. I mean, do you think that's true?
That's right.
Yeah,
I think that's right. I think that's right. Even the book itself, as you said, had a lot of contradictory elements in it. And I think one of the things, frankly, that was going on is that at one point he wanted to really convince the economics profession that kind of the distribution of income was an important question to study, and in this sort of historical way. And so he was trying to frame his arguments in a way that would be acceptable to economists. I think he sort of gave up on that project. So, once he decided that the people he wanted to talk to were, historians and sociologists and the broader public, then he could kind of abandon some of these sort of formal models. But yeah, I mean, I know he read my critique. He said some nice things about it, but other people were certainly making the same argument. So I think at some point, if you take the data seriously and you look at it, you're just going to say this story just doesn't work.
Absolutely. So let's use this framework a little bit more, because there's some more of your articles that I think have been interesting applications of this. So one of them was about Germany. And wealth inequality. Now, some data, I forget exactly where it was from, maybe IMF data, came out that said, Germany is not very wealthy. It has really unequal wealth. A lot of people don't have very much wealth. And you basically, applied this kind of framework about how we think about capital, how we think about wealth. I mean, maybe you can talk to the distinction between the two, and said that, this is completely misleading. These statistics, these monetary statistics don't tell us how wealthy Germany is in terms of actual access to resources like housing.
Well, the relationship between capital and wealth, at that point, we're really getting into sort of the heart of all of these questions. So perhaps we'll bracket that for just a moment, but we definitely do need to spend some time on it, because in some ways, what is capital is sort of the big question in the background of all of this. But let's talk about wealth, which is a little more tractable for just a moment. Yeah, I think it was actually a study from the European Central Bank, but it was a survey of household wealth. And I don't think anybody disputed the numbers, which showed that, the distribution of wealth across Europe was really not, this is a few years ago. So, I'm not sure. I think in a general way, the picture is still going to be the same. I'm not sure, in the details. Some of the lowest levels of wealth, both average wealth and median wealth, were found in Germany and some of the other sort of northern European countries, while quite high levels of wealth, both average and, again, across the distribution, median wealth, were found in some of the southern European countries like Spain, Greece, and Italy. And, at the time, of course, part of the politics of how this played out, this was, as I say, I don't remember 2015 or sometime around then when the sort of European crisis and the conflict with Greece was still quite acute. And so it played into a kind of right-wing politics in Germany where they said, look at these people, they're actually richer than we are, and they're asking for all these special breaks and handouts and so on. But I think what was interesting about that, what was really interesting is if you dug in a little beneath the surface, the real difference, the reason wealth in Germany was lower, household wealth, was because, again, of a question like the one we were just talking about with slavery, the question of what future incomes are embodied in assets, what future incomes become capitalized into something that you can own. So the most important one here is housing. Germany historically, and I think this has shifted a little bit, but it's still generally true. Historically, it's had very low home ownership rates compared with most other rich countries. Well, one reason for that is that historically they've had very strong protections for renters. Not just regulation of the level of rents, rent control, but also security of tenure and so on. So renting a home is really an acceptable alternative to owning one in terms of kind of your ability to be confident that you're going to be able to continue living there, which is of course not true in the U.S. and a lot of other places. I don't know about the UK so much, but so home ownership rates are very low. Well, the biggest, whereas in some Southern European countries, home ownership rates are extremely high. So if you look at that, you live in a house, you're going to continue paying a certain amount of money every month to live in the house. You're going to continue living in the house for an indefinite period. You have the right to make various improvements in the house. Substantively, your situation, if you're a renter with strong legal protections, substantively, your situation is pretty much the same as a homeowner. But you don't have wealth that is going to show up in these sorts of statistics. You don't own an asset. Your right to continue to occupy that house, your right to be, have a sort of relatively fixed schedule of payments, your right to make various improvements and changes to the house. None of those rights are tradable on a market, so they don't show up as an asset. They don't show up as wealth. And so what you see is that household wealth is relatively low in Germany. It doesn't mean that people are worse off in any material sense, but it means that a part of the economy has been relatively demarketized, is relatively less financialized. Still private housing, there's still a landlord, you're still paying money for it, but the rights that go with that are not themselves separately traded assets in the same way. So there's a right of tenure that is not something that you buy, but something you just have by virtue of being a member of the society. So it's not showing up in statistics as a form of wealth, but it is just as valuable to the people who enjoy it. So that's the biggest part of the difference in wealth. But the biggest part, as I say, but another part is that stock market, the price equity rate, or what we call Tobin's Q, basically the ratio of stock prices to the underlying profits of the company. So basically the value of stocks in German corporations is historically much lower than a lot of other places. Actually, one of the interesting things is that the real divergence in sort of measured value of wealth, capital relative to income that happens in the US and the UK and other places, from the 70s onward, a lot of that has to do with the big rise in the value of stocks relative to the underlying flow of profits for those companies. And that really didn't happen to the same extent in Germany. So, if you have obviously direct ownership of stocks, but also, for instance, to the extent these things are in pension funds and other broadly held forms of financial wealth, they're going to look lower. But it doesn't, again, mean that there's less wealth, because, of course, the other thing we know about Germany is that workers at large German corporations have a lot of rights that really don't exist in most other places. They have seats on the board. You look at Volvo, 50% of the seats Volkswagen, 50% of the seats on the board are held by workers. And that's true of most large German corporations. You have workplace councils that handle a lot of sort of day-to-day personnel issues about when you schedule your vacation and so on, that is done by a group of workers and not by your immediate boss. Very different. So you could think of that stuff to some extent as representing some of the surplus that this enterprise generates is sort of going directly to the workers through this other form of ownership. But again, that form of ownership isn't tradable. It doesn't have a value that you can capitalize. It doesn't show up in measures of wealth. So if you are a worker at a workplace and you don't have any legal protections in your job and you don't have any voice in the management of that company, but you do have some stock in your pension fund, you look like you have wealth. If you work at a corporation where you don't have, you have a pension, maybe, another thing, Germany, I think they still have a lot of very traditional defined benefit pensions where there isn't necessarily an independent fund. But let's say you're at another company and you have a claim on that company that doesn't take the form of an asset in your pension fund, but takes the form of a direct right to vote on the management. That's not showing up in measures of your wealth. So the median household, that enjoys that voice in their workplace looks poorer than the median household that has the asset sitting in their pension fund. But it doesn't mean they're substantively worse off. So again, we have to think, we can't treat wealth as equivalent to capital as equivalent to simply a stock of productive assets. It's a claim on income. It's a claim on income that can be traded, that has a market value, that generates a profit that can then be valued in some way. And not every claim on income has those properties. Not every claim on income appears as wealth or capital. And so, this I think when people don't understand, when you don't start from the position that what we have here is a claim on income, that's the primary thing, and then that gets valued. If you start from the other side and you say there's an actual thing that is producing the income, then I think you end up, misinterpreting a lot of things like this comparison of wealth levels across Europe.
So is there a way to make more satisfactory comparisons? I mean, would you have to basically proceed on a case-by-case basis? People who occupy homes, for example, and something, healthcare separately and access to certain goods and resources. Would you have to have it as a kind of like a dashboard or like a matrix of things? I mean, is there an alternative to these really misleading wealth statistics?
I think that's right. I think this is true in a lot of areas. I think the desire to collapse a lot of heterogeneous information into a single scale or measure has led us down a lot of wrong turns in thinking about the economy. I think that we have to be more willing in a lot of areas, not just this one, to say there are a number of different things we can measure, and we have to measure them and report them and think about them separately. I think that's true if we think about wealth, if we think about people's material well-being. If we think, now about supply constraints and we say, oh, well, the economy's at potential output. Well, we're experiencing inflation, and that probably has something to do with the supply side, but maybe we need to actually think about what specific areas are facing supply constraints and not just try to aggregate this all into just a single level of potential GDP or some similar measure. So I think in general, economists and people who are interested in thinking about economics need to be a little bit slower to try to aggregate things into single measures, and a little more willing to think, in a more granular way. There's lots of interesting questions about history that you can't reduce to a single value that goes up, that you can compare over time or across countries or whatever.
Yeah, I'm wondering how we can manage to make people do that. Not just economists, but I think these single metrics they're really useful for. And I use useful in the sense that they're useful to them, for politicians and businesses as well, right? And they serve as really easy heuristics for the media too. We're really attached to these kind of simplistic comparisons. I mean, I agree with you completely, right? But I'm having a hard time imagining how we move away from that and to a more, comprehensive economic analysis.
Well, I think there are ways to do it. But and I think there are plenty of models of people who are doing it right. But maybe we should. You had a bunch of other questions you wanted to talk about. So maybe we should move on. And I do want to come back to this question of capital at some point.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's easy to solve. I wasn't really expecting you to. I was just sort of airing my frustration. I do on this question of capital, because a lot of people are really keen on this proposal, so I want to ask you about it directly. The idea of a social wealth fund. Now, within your framework, my understanding is that, you know, you might have a different perspective of a social wealth fund. So that would be like ownership of stocks, right, basically, and other assets, and then redistributing some of the returns to the citizens of a country as some kind of universal basic income. Now, if I'm understanding your kind of framework correctly, then it would seem that this is a financialized way or a marketized way of providing a basic level of a basic standard of living. And perhaps another way to go about it would be more in line with Germany, where, you know, you would have the right to housing, for example, but that's not necessarily capitalized through assets. So, I mean, what do you think of a social wealth fund? Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, right. I mean, this is the way you have to think about it. You know, we have a lot of tools that we can use. We have a system of production in the world right now that by and large is controlled by private owners of wealth, and by and large can be organized and directed to them based on their own judgment of their private benefit. By and large being an important qualifier here, because I think the real economies we live in are actually much more socialized than we realize. And also that there's a lot that happens in terms of production and the internal organization of private enterprises that is not capitalism. In fact, as we know, private enterprises are not particularly organized internally around property rights or markets. And so I think in some ways that the capitalist at the top who claims the surplus from it likes to sort of treat the whole thing as an embodiment of their desire for more money. But a lot of the organization of work would happen because that's how you have to organize the work. And it really, the fact that somebody at the end of the day is making a profit off of it is not what dictates that organization. You know, if you're going to put up a building, there are just certain ways that are going to get it done quickly with the available materials and safely and reliably. And you know, the fact that somebody's later going to rent it out for profit doesn't dictate how that happens. So all that said, it is the case that we have private owners who control the production process to some substantial degree. And we would like to, you know, reclaim some of their authority and reclaim some of the surplus, the income that they receive for other social ends, for broader social needs. So we have a lot of tools that we could use to do that. You know, traditionally we can tax them, we can regulate them, we can empower the workers directly, and so on. We could also, you know, have the government buy a big stake in the company and then exercise whatever claims it gets as a shareholder. Well, from my point of view, you really have to ask at that point, what are you gaining here? What are the powers that shareholders have that the government does not already have through taxes, through regulation, through its ability to support workers on the ground, organizing? It's not clear to me that there's any big gain there, certainly not proportionate to the cost of establishing a system like this and not proportionate to the cost of legitimating the authority of shareholders in the process of doing this. So, you know, if you want, you know, Walmart to pay its workers more, should you have the government, you know, assemble a huge fund of money so you can buy a substantial interest in Walmart and then put forward a shareholder resolution saying they ought to pay their workers more, or should you just raise the minimum wage? I'm finding it very hard to see what the argument is in the first case. I think if you sort of somehow concede that all the power is held by the shareholders, then, you know, that's the only way to accomplish anything. But that's the point. We don't actually live in a world where all the power is held by the shareholders. Government already, you know, redistributes and regulates and directs business in all sorts of ways using the tools that it already possesses. So it's not clear to me what this tool is adding to the ones that already exist. Now, you know, the one exception, of course, is that if you have a government that for whatever reason finds itself in control of a great deal of financial wealth, then, you know, obviously you might want to think strategically about what you're going to do with that, especially if it's a small economy where you need to exercise a lot of claims on the rest of the world that, you know, you can't do through your normal public authority. So fine, if it's Norway and, you know, and they've got a windfall from North Sea oil, fine, maybe the sovereign wealth fund is a sensible thing for them to have. Although, you know, even in the case of Norway, you can find stories about how they say, oh, we can't, you know, afford to spend more on, you know, various social services because that would draw down our fund. Or here in the United States, Alaska, which has their permanent fund, which is, you know, for the same reason, because of an oil windfall. You know, a few years ago, there were stories about how they were drastically cutting, you know, public universities and other services there because they had to preserve the value of that social wealth fund. So I think even in the strongest case, the cost you're paying in terms of sort of legitimating the accumulation of financial wealth as an objective for the government and legitimating the authority of owners of financial wealth over productive enterprises, it might outweigh whatever benefits you're getting in terms of increasing the capacity of the government to control production and mobilize resources. I think for a government like the UK or the United States or any, to set up it's just completely backward. Everything that you would be doing through the sovereign wealth fund, you should just do. The ability to first, pre-fund it. It's like, if we want to pay for better transit service or education or healthcare, I don't think anybody with remotely progressive politics, I don't think anybody with just a practical sense of how you would achieve this goal is going to say, well, first we should set up a giant, fund. So we should save money. We should raise taxes today. We should cut spending today and wait, run years of austerity till we've accumulated a fund that's big enough to pay for this public service, and then we'll pay for it that way. No. If you want to do something, then you just do it. There's no problem that is being solved by sort of laundering your public spending through some sort of fund before you do it, from my point of view.
Yeah, that's really well put. I think I'm half remembering something that Keynes, I think, said about that. He said, whatever you need to do, you just check that you have the real resources to do it.
Whatever we can actually do, we can afford. It doesn't mean that we can do anything we want to, but you don't remove the real constraints by creating some sort of financial fund.
Mm. Glenn Whale had some interesting critiques of social wealth funds. Actually, I think he said that it would. You can imagine it, especially in America, which is where it's been proposed. You can imagine it kind of becoming this fund that becomes quite nationalistic, and I think it kind of relates to what you were saying about austerity in Alaska, because it becomes a political football, and then it also becomes commensurable with other outcomes. And I just worry about what would happen to such a thing if, for example, Republicans got into power. I mean, I worry about what would happen to anything if Republicans get into power, but you can easily see it being manipulated, right, and becoming nationalistic or, justifying cuts elsewhere or something like that. I'm not sure about the politics of it, even if the economics of it are put to one side.
That's right. And there's an argument there for simplicity and directness. The complicated bank shots are always going to be more vulnerable to changes in government. And setting up additional layers of intermediation are always going to be more vulnerable to changes in government. If you have something like a minimum wage, it's a very simple policy. They pass all the time. Even when you have conservative governments, they're very popular. And it's very simple. It's almost self-enforcing because you put up a sign that says the new minimum wage is, $10 an hour, whatever it is. Everybody knows that. People know to complain. They know to expect that. You don't need a lot of other people who are committed to. You do need enforcement. You need a labor, some type of labor department that's going to sue businesses that aren't following the law. But it's not complicated. It's not hard to figure out if they are following the law. Whereas when you have something where you're going to say, well, we're going to set up this fund and it's going to be invested according to these criteria, and then they're going to make certain demands on the executives of these businesses, and there's really very little way of knowing whether all of these instructions are being followed. There's a lot of decision makers with a lot of autonomy in between. It's making your whatever you're trying to do a lot more vulnerable to various slips on the way to execution. I think there's, I just read this very interesting book. I actually wrote a review of it in Jacobin, Beth Pop Berman's book, Thinking Like an Economist. And one point I think she makes very persuasively is that the sort of older model of regulation, before the economists took over, was very focused on simple, unambiguous rules. This substance is illegal. You may not emit it from your smoke tax in any quantity. And, typical environmental, the Clean Air Act. Here's a list of things. You can't put them in the air. Clean Water Act. You can't dump this stuff in the water. That's it. No exceptions. And, the economists, when they came in, hated this. They said, well, wait a minute, a little bit is only a little cost, and maybe some businesses have an easy time reducing this and others have a hard time, and we need to weigh costs and benefits. And maybe if you reduce emissions a lot at one place, then you don't have to as much somewhere else. And it sounds very rational, let's look at trade-offs. But what it results in is a system where it's much harder to tell if the rules are being followed, a system where there's a lot more discretion at different points, a system that can be gamed in a lot of different ways. And so, there's actually, the economists present themselves as the very clear-eyed, let's just focus on results here. But actually, there's something very unworldly and idealistic about their perspective, because these complicated rules only work if they're administered perfectly. And I think, the older model of regulation, which is just hard rules, no exceptions, was much more realistic about what the limits on the sort of administrative capacity of the state are likely to be. So I think, the same goes here. We really, if we're worried about who's going to administer this thing and whether they're going to be trusted and whether the courts are going to, have their finger on the scale in various ways and all these practical questions, then that really puts a premium on things that are simple and unambiguous and direct. You want to sort of limit the number of steps between, the policy and the outcome.
Yeah, if people need houses, then build houses. How many houses
Right.
do we have? Is it enough for the number of people? Can they afford it? That's it, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes, that's right.
Let's talk a little bit more about ownership, because there's one more thing. So as we all know, Elon Musk has bought Twitter, and we've all been watching it unravel in real time with some of his inexplicable decisions. But you wrote a really interesting article recently, and by the way, I missed your review of Thinking Like an Economist. I'll have to check that out. But you wrote an article on your blog about how Musk's ownership of Twitter really highlights a kind of almost a contradiction in how we think about ownership in shareholder capitalism and the difference between ownership and control.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's there's this sort of monarchical notion that we have that the person at the top who collects the surplus is also in some sense responsible for everything that happens in that business. But in general, of course, we know that's not true at all. You can just sit on the top and collect your surplus. It's funny when you think about this, and I should say, I personally, I like Twitter. For me, the use of Twitter has been very positive, and I'm sad that it seems likely that he's gonna destroy the thing. Just in passing, but if you're Elon Musk, and assuming you're not in just your complete chaos mode where you're listening to some MAGA blogger or whatever venture capitalist has sucked up to you the most that week. If you're actually trying to run a business, you're trying to build electric cars, you're going to hire people based on their credentials and their ability to do their job. There's going to be some sort of evaluation. And you're not going to say, well, because your father did this job, you should have it. Or, now that you have this job, you can't ever be removed. Or because you have this job, you have the right to, control who gets hired for this other job. We could organize businesses that way. And some places you could argue maybe they are, but in general, that's not the model he's going to want to follow. He's going to want to follow a sort of bureaucratic, rational one that's based on just looking at people's ability to do their particular job and no other personal characteristics, and that's going to be sort of how you fill these positions. But then if you ask, well, how does Elon Musk himself get that position? It doesn't look like that at all. There's no social process of evaluating whether he's the best qualified to do this job or whether he should continue doing it, or and he has obviously the discretion to fill all these other positions however he wants to based on the fact that he's got this one. So there's this contradiction between the sort of rational bureaucratic way that we think business will be organized by private owners and the way that private owners themselves acquire and exercise their positions. We've got this sort of strange fusion of a kind of bureaucratic model internal to the firm, a kind of rational one, and then this sort of, as I say, sort of monarchical divine right model of who actually gets to sit at the top of the thing. And it's, usually we can sort of ignore it. We ignore it. Well, we can, maybe at one point in the 20th century say, well, the owner is sort of disappearing from the picture. They're not really relevant anymore. But that's, clearly not a good model for Elon Musk, who's, again, unfortunately very relevant for the businesses he owns. Or, we can have this sort of cult of the CEO that somehow, you arrive at that position because of your unique, one-of-a-kind, abilities. But the reality is we just have a sort of incoherent system, which is, on some level surprising, where we combine one kind of vision of how we organize production with a completely different one in which it's a kind of, rational system of meeting certain ends that we've agreed are important using the resources that are available, and the other, which is it's the private domain of people who've simply got it and are legally entitled to keep it no matter what and dispose of it how they choose to. So, again, a lot of times that contradiction isn't so evident, but in the case of Twitter, clearly we're seeing it very visibly in real time. The notion of treating it as private property and the notion of treating it as an important social goal that we want to try to meet in a rational way are just colliding head on here.
Yeah, I mean, what's your view of, how better to align these things? Because I'm a bit of a fan of, well, actually, I'm a big fan of like worker democracy and also other forms of co-op like consumer co-ops as well. Because I suppose they align ownership and control better in the way you're talking about, but they also, I think, they give power to people who are, generally don't have power, and they are redistributive as well. So is that something that you're potentially on board with? I mean, you mentioned Germany earlier and the corporate boards there.
I mean, I don't know, to be honest. And I think, it's sort of a shame in a way, because I think that, the internet economy and the fact that we were creating these new enterprises and new forms of activity that really hadn't existed before, gave us a little bit of a fresh slate and an opportunity to rethink, who gets authority over production and how that's assigned. And for the most part, that's opportunity has been sort of been missed. One thing that I sometimes think about in this context is Wikipedia is a thing that exists. Like, it exists. People rely on it. It's one of the most important institutions in our sort of on the internet. Of course, you look something up, you're going to do a Google search. Then where are you going to look? You're going to look on Wikipedia. It's much more important than Twitter, probably, in any sort of global sense. And it's not organized as a private business. It doesn't have ownership. It has a very dispersed structure of control. It has its own sort of social norms that people always make fun of, the Wikipedia editors. But honestly, it really works. It works quite well. And of course we know that, Linux is this operating system that is used all over the world in a lot of, private businesses to manage their computers. And again, it's not the property of any business. It has this sort of decentralized system. So, those models exist. It's not impossible to have that kind of structure. But, unfortunately, I think if you could imagine rolling back the clock, it would have been much easier, some years ago at the beginning of the sort of growth of all these new technologies and industries to try to, push for that model to be more widespread. I don't know today, how should Twitter be organized? Is there a Wikipedia-like model for Twitter? I guess Mastodon is trying to offer that. I don't know if that's going to be successful or not. I think, but again, I think we also should be cautious about, I think it's on the one hand, it's important to ask the big blue sky questions and imagine a very different way of organizing this stuff. But I think we should avoid the trap of saying that until we have figured that out, we can't do anything to address these problems. Because again, we have government that has, in the US, in the UK, in most of the advanced world, has a degree of accountability. There's a responsiveness to popular pressure that exists. And it has a lot of tools for shaping production in a lot of ways already. And we have, cultural norms. This is outside of the scope of this conversation, but I think a lot of the, the anger that people get about Twitter, the woke mobs and about cancel culture is just a reaction to the existence of a sort of widespread shifting in democratic norms. The fact that, the recognition of the humanity of trans people is something that is just for a lot of us, just an absolute baseline requirement of being a decent person and participating in conversation. And if you don't meet that standard, we're not going to listen to you. And the fact that enough people feel that pressure, it's progress. It's progress. And that's a way in which we have a sort of decentralized shifting of norms that is happening in the world. And again, in this particular area, I think in an extremely, positive way. So I think there are ways in which institutions like Twitter can be made better and can be shaped to suit a broader set of social norms and not just the interests of whoever happens to own them, that don't require us to rethink from the ground up the way in which we organize it. It can be formally a private business and still be responsive to broad democratic pressures in many ways. So I think we need to be able to sort of have both of those thoughts in our minds at the same time. Both are sort of big picture of a radically different way of organizing the world, but also keep in mind that there are a lot of concrete things we can do starting from where we are.
Yeah, that's really well put. And I think we could speak about like how to organize Twitter more, but I think I did call this conversation Marxism without the rubbish bits. And we haven't directly spoken about Marx, but I mean, what you've said has obviously already been influenced by Marx. So, I mean, I'm not 100% sure on this, Josh, but you would call yourself a Marxist, right? Is
Well,
that right?
I don't know. I don't. Back in graduate school, I always used to say, well, I don't know enough Marx to call myself a Marxist. I haven't studied enough because where I went to graduate school, I happened to be surrounded by people who really were very deep thinkers on Marx and had spent a great deal of time studying Marx. So um, I'm not, I think anybody, I don't know how many people, some people will say I'm a Marxist. I think most people resist saying, oh, I'm a thisist, I'm a thatist. I always, when I'm thinking about some difficult question, I'm going to think about what Marx would have said about it, and I'm going to think about what Keynes would have said about it. And I'm probably going to start there at those 2 points before I think about anything else if it's something I'm really struggling with. I think Marx gives us an essential language for understanding the world that we live in. I think there's a lot of questions about the world, fundamental questions that you're going to have a very difficult time thinking clearly about or really engaging with unless you've spent some time really taking Marx seriously and reading him, thinking about him, and engaging with the people in the Marxist tradition. I think that you need to have that language available to you. You need to be a part of that conversation and a respectful part of that conversation, not a debunker, if you want to think about a lot of the questions that we're talking about here in a really serious way. Do you have to call yourself a Marxist? I'm not sure that you do. I'm always going to be somebody who thinks, if somebody says, well, what you're saying goes right against what Marx said, I'm going to step back and say, wait a minute, maybe I need to rethink my views here, figure out how, so does that make me a Marxist? Maybe it does, but I don't find the labels super helpful. Sorry, I could have probably just said that. Not giving that long-winded answer.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm almost glad because that's what I thought. What you said is what I thought, right? Like you're obviously heavily influenced by Marx as well as Keynes and others, but maybe not like a kind of diehard Marxist. But yeah, maybe there's no need to put a label on it. But I suppose one thing I'm interested in is like which elements, or we can stick to one because it's such a big question, but which elements of Marx's thought do you find really valuable for analyzing capitalism?
Well, let's go back to capital, because this is we touched on at the beginning. What is this thing, capital? What is the relationship between capital and wealth? Because of course, for Marx, this is the central question that he's asking, and the organizing sort of central organizing principle of his thought. So I think if he's useful for anything, it should be for this. And I think one of the things that we really can get from Marx is that capital is not just one thing. And if you try to start from one thing, then you're going to have a one-sided and incomplete and probably misleading picture of capital. We have to think of a process, a social process that goes through different steps. This is the cycle of capital that people talk about. And in particular, we have to think about capital simultaneously as being means of production, machines, knowledge, software, whatever those tangible things are that allow us collectively to transform the world in ways that make it suit our needs better. That's one thing that people mean by capital. It's also a quantity of money that is seeking to expand itself over time. So this is where we can talk about a quantity when we think about it as money. At the point where it becomes money expressed as value, it has a quantity, the machines, the tools, the software, and so on, the scientific knowledge, all of which constitutes capital in that first sense. We can't put a number on them. We can't put a quantity on them, but a quantity of money, yes. So it's money, and it's money that is over time growing, and that's from one point of view, it's what the capitalist cares about the most. Although the capitalist can be sort of located at any of these 3 points. So you've got the machines, the tangible means of production. You've got a quantity of money that is growing, and that's what gives the system its dynamism, the constant need to find new ways of generating greater money flows from out of the money that you already control. And then, equally important with the first two, it's a relationship. It's a social relationship between people. It's a relationship of hierarchy. It's a relationship of the boss to the workers. It's a characteristic of a society in which people surrender their autonomy in the workplace in order to get access to the things that they need to live. So it's the authority in the workplace that you surrender your free will to during the workday. It's all of those things. It's the machines, and it's the money, and it's the boss. And the capitalist as a person, if you read volume 1 of Capital, he's giving you a very simplified and sort of abstract, almost cartoon version of this. So you imagine it's one person, who shows up with a bag of money, buys some machines and raw materials, and then gives the command to labor to transform those into something else. And then that product he sells for more money and walks away at the end of the day with this bigger bag of money. In the real world, obviously, these are large, complex, ongoing social processes. And the sort of social person who is sort of the steward of the machines, and the social person who is the holder of the money, and the social person who is giving commands to labor may not all be the same person. And so the capitalist becomes a little bit diffuse. But I think we have to have this notion that capital is all three of these things, not simultaneously, but sort of in a sequence, in a cycle. And it has all of these aspects if we're going to really think about the sorts of questions that we're interested in. I think this vision is really distinct to Marx. There's a tendency among economists certainly to try to flatten this out. Capital is just a quantity of stuff, which happens also to be measurable in money, and it has the same set of relationship through mutually agreeable exchange as anything else in the economy. And we can imagine a world in which ownership of, or let's say control over, the tangible means of production, machines, tools, buildings, and so on, did not give you any particular authority in the workplace. We can imagine a world of worker co-ops that, rent whatever supplies, equipment they need from somebody to use them as they see fit for a certain period of time and then return them, and that the owner of the machine gets the rent and doesn't get any authority over the production process. We can logically, the control of the means of production and the authority over production, the production process itself, are two, separable things. It's a distinctive feature of the particular kind of society that we live in that they are normally combined. And again, seeing that as something distinct, not seeing it as just a sort of natural, logical result of the fact that people are working together to make things, but seeing this as a very distinct, historically novel and contingent way of organizing societies, I think is something you really get from Marx. And it focuses your attention on questions that you might not even ask otherwise, like how does that hierarchy get maintained in the workplace, and how is work organized in order to maintain that hierarchy? I think for a lot of people, probably that's, if there's a sort of entry to Marx and Marxism that is not just a sort of intellectual interest, but as a kind of emotional interest, like this is speaking to a problem that I have. This is answering to the needs that I actually, as a human being, really need. It's this thing, the fact that there's this talk about hierarchy and coercion and violence in the workplace. If you read, some of the great classics of sort of relatively modern Marxism, like Harry Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital, it's about how hierarchy and domination are the central organizing principles of work, and not just the sort of needs of efficient production. Or, Steve Margolin, the sort of one token Marxist economist or radical economist. I don't know if you'd call himself a Marxist anymore. Radical economist at Harvard. He had a wonderful piece called "What Do Bosses Do?" Just sort of looking historically at the early Industrial Revolution and looking at how much the reorganization of work, if you look at what people were talking about and what specific things they were prioritizing, was about control over labor and not just more efficient production in some abstract sense. Or David Noble's Forces of Production, about the early, the growth of automation in manufacturing, and talking about how, initially, there was a sort of fully automated, they call it, I'm trying to remember, but basically where you script all the movements of the machine in some, this is pre-electronic form, on punch cards or in some way, or maybe they're even hardwired, but all this is done versus a record and playback system that was an early rival of it, where you have a skilled machinist who does the operation, and then the machine records their actions and then duplicates them. And, Noble's argument is that the record and playback system was technically superior. There was no question. You got a better product. You had less upfront investment. It was much easier to record the operations of somebody who already knew how to do this than to try to script the whole thing from the ground up. But businesses really preferred the other approach because it allowed them to eliminate their dependence on these skilled workers. So I think if we actually look at the history of production, we look at the history of work, we can find an enormous number of stories like this. And I think this is something that if you don't have that sort of Marxist perspective that hierarchy and domination of the workplace are fundamentally constitutive of capital, but they are logically independent from capital in these other senses, I think you're just going to miss those stories about the world. And I think if we actually want to understand how this system has evolved over time, those stories are incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a lot there that a lot of avenues for us to go down. I mean, I think you were talking about capital as a physical quantity and how mainstream economists tend to think about it that way. And I think one thing Marxism really does is it kind of shows how mistaken that view is, right? Because that's this kind of idea as the economy. It could be the economy or capital as something that's just like separate, and whether it's physical or whether it's measured by like GDP. And I think the way we think about the economy, both in mainstream economics and just in general discourse, it often really obscures these social relations. And the fact that basically, capitalism is a social relation that centers around, how we treat work and, who production goes to. And I mean, you mentioned it, worker co-ops and them renting out capital. I mean, it sounds like you were thinking of like David Ellerman. I don't know if you've read anything by him or whether it was just.
I haven't. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, okay. So yeah, I mean, it's again one of those things that a few people have a conclusion a few people have come to, but David Ellerman, it goes into sort of the legal foundations of abolishing the employment contract and having exactly that kind of system that you spoke about where capital is rented out. And yeah, I think like there are lots of ways Marxism is helpful, right? So you've got things like where a lot of mainstream economic analysis falls short, I think, is like the there's no impetus to explain, how things came to be commensurable under capitalism, right? How they came to be measured through this common money standard. And for Marx, he makes a distinction between like use value and exchange value, which makes this really, really clear. Whereas I think, a lot of mainstream economists would tend to just collapse that into the same thing. So they just talk about like utility and preferences.
That's exactly right. That somehow whatever the inherent qualities of a thing, a commodity are that make it useful to us, desirable use value, are just naturally and transparently reflected in its exchange value. The money is just an arbitrary numeraire. It's just a completely arbitrary yardstick for measuring the sort of value which is already present in the thing itself. And, I think what Marx tells us very clearly is that no, the process of making everything commensurable in such a way that you can make these comparisons is something that had to happen historically and was a very, violent, disruptive process and not in any way a complete process up till the present. Until you have, let's say, labor that is wage labor, that's the main form of production, that is proletarianized so that one person's labor is essentially equivalent to anybody else's labor, and that it's employed with the goal of producing a profit so that you will employ just as much labor as you need and no more. There's no underlying reason why goods should have a consistent set of values that they exchange for that have any sort of quantitative relationship to each other. And of course, the process of exchange, as we know, maybe not so much from Marx, but from anthropologists and historians, often inspired by Marx, until the rise of capitalism, doesn't look in any way like a process of barter where you would see some type of consistent relative prices emerge. To the extent exchange happens, it's highly embedded in other social relationships, and whatever price things have is really going to be regulated by all sorts of customary or traditional or legal factors that don't reflect any sort of logic of scarcity or anything like that. So this commensurability of things as commodities, the fact that everything has a price tag and the price tags are related in some consistent ways, is a historically new development under capitalism. It's not just a sort of fact about the world.
Yeah, I mean, you could be forgiven if you went through a standard economics degree for thinking that that wasn't the case, right? I think you could be forgiven for just thinking that the economy and markets especially just sort of existed from time immemorial and it wasn't located historically, which is again something that Marx does very well.
Yeah, I only took, as an undergraduate, at the University of Chicago, incidentally, I took one economics class, an introductory class. On the first day, we had a desert island and people were making, I don't know, kelp bats and catching crabs or whatever, coconuts. I don't know. They're two production tasks that they do on this island. And so we get a little demonstration of comparative advantage. Even if one of them is better at both of the tasks, they'll both still be better off if they specialize in exchange. Mm. That's day one. Day two, we get a little exercise on rent control and why rent control is bad because it's going to limit the supply of apartments below the market clearing level and actually make tenants worse off. So
seamlessly moving from crabs to actual housing markets in the real world. Yeah,
I have. It's wait a minute. How do I get from the desert island to a world with workers and landlords and a government that can regulate them? It seems like we skipped over a few steps here. So, I decided economics was not for me after I took that class. But yeah, the fact that this is a system with history, and not just a history in the past, but it evolves over time. That there's this constant pressure towards innovation, towards pushing down costs, towards reasserting control over the workplace, and then of course pressures that point in the other direction. And so this is a transformative process. I think this is why somebody like Schumpeter, actually really appreciated Marx, even coming from a very political position that really couldn't be more opposed in some ways, is the vision of this as a process of transformation and not just a sort of settling into an equilibrium dictated by the pre-existing givens of the system, people's existing resources and preferences. Knut Wicksell, who's an interesting economist who kind of invented our modern idea of monetary policy 120 years ago. He had a metaphor of growth as being like wines aging in a wine cellar. The wine is okay, you can drink it now, you enjoy it, but if you let it sit a few more years, you'll enjoy it more. And so the whole question is just making that trade-off, present enjoyment or wait and get more enjoyment in the future. The whole thing is known in advance. It's all completely predicted already. And the only thing we have to just choose is, which trade-off between, now versus more later we're going to make. Whereas what Marx, understood, very clearly, and other people, Marxists and non-Marxists like Schumpeter have understood, is the historical process of growth doesn't look like that at all. It's a process where people are constantly discovering new things, transforming the world in ways that couldn't have been anticipated in advance at all. It's not a matter of just trading off the present and the future that you can sort of plan completely in advance, which is still the sort of growth models that are taught to people in economic programs today.
Mm. Yeah, Joan Robinson said that Schumpeter was Marx with the adjectives changed, didn't she? The same analysis, but actually this is good. Although it's worth saying Marx, of course, was a massive admirer of capitalism as well as one of its fiercest critics.
That's right. Yeah, no, he certainly saw this transformational potential as being liberatory, for humanity, even despite being, destructive and violent in the moment. I think, just to say just a moment more on this, I think, a lot of times if you really want to understand sort of what's the value of Marx and what do you get from Marx that you won't get from other economists, you should really, you'll often find that more if you read Marx-influenced historians, perhaps, because they are the ones who are going to be more focused on this transformational character. Like, I think, I would almost say if you want to understand the Marxist vision, the best book to start with would be Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton, which really has everything there in a story that, he hardly mentions Marx. He certainly doesn't say, I am writing an illustration of Marx's argument in Capital, but it really functions that way. And it shows you, all the, on the one hand, the pursuit of ever expanding quantities of money, which is taking place in conjunction with, but but as a distinct element from the transformation of the production process and the accumulation of more machinery and raw materials, and the transformation of the land, and then the hierarchical relationships with labor that are absolutely fundamental and essential to this. And as this happens, it's a transformational process, not just of production, but of political relationships and institutions and patterns of trade, and includes, and something we were touching on earlier, which is the quantification of the world, not just in the sense of putting money values on things, but transforming the things themselves in a way that they can be easily valued. So, for instance, breeding cotton in such a way that you have only a few standard varieties, so that you can very easily price them, as opposed to having a sort of heterogeneous mix of different fibers with different qualities. So all of this stuff, that Marx describes comes through, I think, very clearly in this book about the evolution of the cotton industry over the past 500 years, in a way that if you were to, read sort of a Marxist economist, or even a kind of guide to Marx in an abstract way, you might not get, I think, nearly as vividly.
Well, that's a really interesting recommendation. I've never, I mean, in some ways, the link between the two is kind of obvious, but then I've never heard anybody recommend it in that context before. That's Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton, by the way, that Josh was talking about, everyone, in case you wanted to read it. A lot of people are also talking about David Graeber's Debt, which is slightly different, but, gets at some of the same historicism.
I love that book. I think it's a great book. I think it's been unfairly maligned by people, despite its flaws, but it's not as complete a picture as the Beckert, because the labor process and the hierarchy of production is almost entirely absent from Graeber, which is not necessarily criticism of the book. That's not the book, but it is. You can't say that he's giving you a sort of historical vision of Marx's argument in the same way that I think you can with the Beckert book.
Maybe he tries to centralize debt a bit too much, and in the contemporary times, I found that book became less convincing. Maybe because of that. Yeah. The last chapter is weaker than the rest of the book. That's for sure. Yeah. So I want to talk about. So you actually privately sent me a paper by somebody whose name escapes me. Wait, here it is. James Crotty. On Marx, and I'd like to talk about that, because that's about crisis theory. Now, there are two things I want to say while we're talking about the good in Marx before we talk about the rubbish bits. I think that reminded me how good Marx's critique of Say's law is. I thought, because Keynes had a critique and it was a bit roundabout, and I actually think Keynes initially drew more from Marx's critique, but I think possibly for political reasons he wanted to distance himself from Marx, and then he ended up making a different critique. So for everyone, Say's law is the idea that supply creates its own demand, and therefore there can't be like a general shortfall in aggregate demand, because if there's any production, there will automatically be corresponding demand. But Marx, and this relates to what you were saying about capitalism as an engine of accumulation, Marx's MCM was a really, really clear, direct rebuttal to this idea, right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, Keynes, his published comments on Marx are pretty uniformly negative. He talks about the rubbish of the red bookstores and so on. But he does have a line. I think it's in a letter to somebody, and I'd have to find it where exactly it is, where he says, Marx understands the critical thing that most, economists miss, which is that capitalism is not a system of production for its own sake. It is not, in Marxian terms, CMC. It's not about, money is not intermediary in an exchange of goods for goods. The accumulation of money is the object of production. It's so that's a very different kind of system than the sort of barter system, or barter using money system that a lot of economists. So Keynes, at least privately, definitely recognized an affinity with Marx on this. I think the point on Say's law, in some level, is very simple, which is that production, of course, produces income that is equivalent to the value of the things that are produced. So in principle, then you would say, okay, there's always sufficient income to buy all the current output of the system. But the problem is that although it's true that production always generates income equivalent to the value of the product, that income does not, in fact, have to be spent on the product. It can be spent, in particular, the fact that people can accumulate money or similar assets, or seek to accumulate money or other assets, means you can simultaneously have excess demand for wealth, money, whatever financial form people are trying to accumulate money or wealth, and inadequate demand for produced goods and services. And that said, I think we should be clear, this is not the main story of aggregate demand in a Keynesian sense. This is a story perhaps of transitions or crisis moments. Keynes was interested in a situation of what he called unemployment equilibria, where everything that is produced is being sold, but you're producing less than the real resources of your economy would allow you to. It's not that people are trying to, it's not that Say's law is failing. It's not that there's stuff being produced that just isn't sold, but it's that, in a sense, the level of both income and production is lower than it could be in the presence of more spending. So it's a little bit of a different story. And it requires, for Keynes, it requires us to bring in a different theory of the interest rate to explain why that situation can persist. But you mentioned the Crotty piece, which I agree is absolutely a brilliant piece, and I think it really illustrates how some of the criticisms of Marx are a little off the mark. In some ways, I think because perhaps more than a lot of other writers, Marx very consciously operates at different levels of abstraction in different pieces of writing. And so he's sometimes trying to sort of zero in on what he sees as the most essential elements of the system and really work through those. In other cases, perhaps not the most essential, but simply the ones that he's chosen as a starting point, because you can't write about the entire system at once. If we think capital is a circuit, from money to commodities to labor and the production process, back to commodities and back to money, you have to start somewhere. And in Capital Volume 1, he chooses to really start in the production process. And I think he had good reasons for doing that. But in some sense, logically, you could have started at a different point in the cycle, just as reasonably. So that leads people to think that Marx is sort of dismissive of money or monetary factors. And I think what this Crowdy piece shows very clearly is that when you get to a more concrete level, Marx, who was, among other things, he was a working journalist for most of his life and a very acute observer of current developments in the British economy and economies elsewhere and in the business press. He was very aware of the role of specifically financial factors and credit in driving the periodic crises that the economy was subject to. That, he did have a vision, and we can, I know this is an interest of yours, that the underlying sort of ultimate source of this instability was fluctuations in the rate of profit over time. But he was also very clear that is strongly mediated by the financial system, by credit. That, in the abstract, you might think that a fall in the rate of profit might just lead to a slower pace of accumulation. If you have this vision of capitalists accumulate their profits, their surplus, they claim it in the form of money, they convert that money back into new means of production and, control over more labor power and so on. If you're getting a smaller surplus, then the next stage will happen at a smaller scale. There's no reason that should be a crisis as opposed to just sort of a deceleration in the accumulation process. And the reason, Marx says very clearly, the reason what you actually see are booms and busts and not just gradual accelerations and decelerations is because of the whole structure of credit commitments that's built on top of this production process. That capitalists operate with credit, which builds in a certain expectation of future profits that will validate that credit. And when those don't materialize, you don't just get slower accumulation, but you get a violent disruption in the accumulation process. There's something, it almost, at least in sort of Crotty's version, but I think Crotty's version is pulling out something that is really there. It almost sounds like an anticipation of Hyman Minsky and theories of financial fragility. So I think again, we can debate whether how productive or how that we think it is to sort of emphasize this sort of ultimate grounding of instability and crises in the profit rate. But I think it's clear that Marx is not just drawing a sort of one simple mechanical link from the profit rate to the dynamics of the system, but is very aware that in real capitalist economies, finance and credit is the immediate and proximate cause of crises and instability, and plays a big role in determining kind of the form of these crises and how violent they are.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Herman Minsky. It also struck me on reading it. It really reminded me of Wynne Godley as well, who obviously, for those of people who don't know the name, he did a lot on like what he called the monetary circuit, and how, before an entrepreneur or business person produces, they have to often get credit. They have to get funding somehow. That's usually credit. And then production takes place, and then they are able to sell and make a profit, and then pay back the money. And I think that's the crucial thing, right? The link between, if there's a lower realized rate of profit, then they can't pay back that debt, that they've incurred. Then this is what kind of amplifies the crisis for Marx. Am I getting that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of steps that can potentially happen, because credit isn't just a matter of specialized financial institutions, but there's an enormous world of trade credit and commercial credit, so that it's other functioning capitalists who are on the hook, who may not be able to service their debt if they're they've sold something on 30 days or 60 days or 90-day invoice, and then it doesn't get paid, and now they can't pay their whoever their suppliers in turn. So it can happen at that level, and obviously to the extent that you have a dependence on credit and financial institutions, if those institutions fail because of some interruption, some borrower who can't repay their loan, and they can't extend the credit that other functioning businesses are expecting, you can have a situation where an interruption in accumulation at one point gets generalized into a broad crisis, or again, where a decline in profits that could have, in principle, just been a sort of smooth thing, instead turns into an abrupt slowdown. And I think people who've tried to apply this framework in the modern world, I think, have often been sensitive to this, that even if the sort of initial impetus is a fall in profitability, the actual way that gets mediated and turned into a crisis really happens through the financial system.
So let's talk about the falling rate of profit, because like you said, it's something that I've taken an interest in, and there are different interpretations of it. I mean, as far as I have seen, there are at least three. One is the idea of it as a very long-term tendency that manifests over hundreds of years, and is a very slight decline year to year. Another one is that it's basically unfalsifiable, which you get from some people, some literature that I've been linked to, and they say you can't necessarily observe it, but it's just a tendency. But I think the one we're interested in here, at least for now, is the view of the rate of profit as something that declines actually quite quickly in episodic crises, right? So after World War II, according to most like sort of Marxist authors who estimate this, you can see quite a rapid, and when I say rapid, I mean historically rapid, so over 20 years or something, a decline in the rate of profit. And they would say that is kind of a Marxist decline of profitability, which then saw a crisis of capitalism in the 70s as capital reasserted itself. So is this, do you kind of buy this interpretation of the falling rate of profit?
I think we really have to take a step back before we ask those questions, because the first question is, does the profit rate matter? Does aggregate profitability really matter? To use the title of an article by Andrew Glynn on this topic some years ago. So the first, the thing that distinguishes the Marxist perspective from the non-Marxist perspective here is not the behavior of the profit rate as such. It is a view that the behavior of the profit rate is very important. So I think that's really the question that we want to address first. Are we convinced that when profits are high, we're going to see strong, steady growth. We're going to see relative political stability. We're going to see, one set of dynamics. And when profit rates are low, we're going to see financial crises. We're going to see instability. We're going to see, a political search for sort of a new regime that can restore profitability. Because I think this is really the heart of the story here, is not about the underlying behavior of the profit rate, but about why it matters and what happens when profits are high or low. I think all kinds of people, the book I love on this stuff, unfortunately it's quite dated now, but I think for the period it covers, it's still very good, is Capitalism Since 1945, or in the UK, Capitalism Since the War, by Andrew Glynn, who I mentioned a moment ago, and two authors, Harrison and I think Sutcliffe might be Armstrong, Harrison and Glynn. where they really try to tell a story where essentially we can see the sort of pattern of the recovery, sort of a three-stage thing, the sort of instability and crisis immediately after the war, the recovery and the sort of glorious years of growth, and then the renewed instability and crises, from the 70s. We can see this in terms of the behavior of the profit rate, and then we can look back and see what was driving those swings in the profit rate. So again, they emphasize, going back to our conversation at the beginning, the fact that the crisis immediately after World War II was not about an absolute lack of resources or means of production, but it was about the fact that all of the sort of social relationships of production had been so disrupted, not even so much by the war, as by the end of the war and the collapse of a lot of the governments that had carried out the war on the victorious side in some cases, like France, as well as on the losing side. And so the need to establish a new stable set of relationships of authority in the workplace. So that was sort of the precondition of establishing a steady flow of profits. And then, once profitability was restored, that created the condition for rapid accumulation. But over time, that eventually undermined its own conditions and created set the stage for the crises at the end of that period. So the key thing here is you want to understand why the profit rate matters. And then once you've convinced yourself that's true, that it does matter, and thought about why it matters, then you want to think about what are the big factors that influence the behavior of the profit rate over some period of time. And we can talk about, is it the balance of power in the workplace between labor and capital? Is it the behavior of sort of the mix of fixed capital? And if you depend on more fixed capital, the profit rate is going to come down. Is it technological changes that make it possible to get more or less output out of a given flow of investment? Is it claims by other actors besides labor and capital, like the state, or maybe in some cases, older classes, landlords, or whatever? You can ask those questions and come up with a coherent story about why the profit rate is doing what it's doing. And once you've done those two things, maybe kind of at the end, you're left with some kind of long-term trend one way or another. But to me, the long-term trend is kind of the last thing you worry about and the least interesting part of the story. That's from where I'm sitting. The important thing you want to ask is, why does the profit rate matter, and why does it behave the way it does? And then the actual specifics are kind of a historical question that are going to depend on the period you're looking at.
Yeah, that's really, really well put. I mean, one of the things that I think I've found, from reading through the literature is like, it seems to me that the rate of profit falling only is seen to only make sense at quite a highly aggregated level. So, I mean, depending on who you ask, that could be like the whole of a national economy. For some people, they actually say you should only look at the global economy. You can't even look at single nation states. But I suppose, we were talking about the monetary circuit earlier, right? We were saying, the entrepreneur incurs debts, the capitalist incurs debts, then they have to do to produce something and sell it. If they have a low rate of profit, that might trigger them not paying it back, which could trigger a crisis. But that was at the individual level. So I feel like sometimes there's a bit of a dissonance here, because I wonder, if a decline in aggregate profits, especially if there's quite a lot of high variance between industries in profit rates, I wonder how much it really matters for like individual capitalists on the ground. So, I mean, what do you think of that? I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is where I might part company with some people who would call themselves Marxists. I'm not sure that the aggregate profit rate is something that we can measure. I don't think it's either. I'm skeptical that there is even in principle a coherent object there that could be measured. And I'm extremely skeptical that there is something we can measure in any consistent way. So I think that to the extent that our story is really going to hinge on measuring the profit rate correctly, I think our story is probably not going to be very robust. A lot of people who do this sort of analysis focus on the profit share rather than the profit rate, which is much easier to measure because we're comparing flows of dollar income to other flows of dollar income. With the profit rate, you got to measure the quantity of capital. And
we've already discussed that.
We talked about earlier. I don't think that's something you can do in the way that you would need to do it for this story. So I'm sort of skeptical that talking about if your profitability, you say profitability, it's sort of vague term what you mean exactly, but if you mean the profit rate, the flow of profits divided by the stock of capital, I think that you should not be making claims about the world that depend on measuring that number correctly, because I don't think you can do it. So maybe that doesn't mean that we don't talk about profits. Maybe we talk about the profit share. Maybe we talk about the absolute flow of profits. Or maybe we have a story that is reasonably robust to a wide range of measures of the profit rate, such that we think we can talk about the profit rate without having to be super careful about exactly how we're measuring it. The Capitalism Since 1945 book I mentioned a little while ago does make some effort to measure the capital stock in some consistent way so that they can talk about profit rates. To me, it's still even though I'm sort of skeptical about that operation, I find it's a very compelling book because of the way that it connects up the developments they're talking about to all sorts of concrete historical developments. So, if we say, here's the way in which labor was getting stronger, and here's how that showed up as an increase in the share of income going to labor, and also here's why we can credibly say that the fall in labor productivity reflected some shift of balance of power in the workplace because workers aren't willing to be pushed as hard or whatever. And then we can say, okay, that fall in the flow of profit income, we can say, leads to change in the behavior of capitalists. Maybe they invest less, or maybe they don't stop investing, but they start looking for broader political solutions than they were. You can tell that whole story without actually, you may tell it in terms of a profit rate measured relative to the capital stock, but you can actually tell that story without needing to measure the capital stock correctly. So I think that is something we have to be sensitive to, because I don't think the sort of profit rate in the way that some people in the Marxist tradition want to talk about it is really something that is going to be meaningfully measurable.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I have found, right, and I made a thread on this and I mentioned it in the video I made on the topic, but I'm not 100% sure using these measures that the rate of profit falling is that robust. And
it's not robust at all. It's not robust at all. People will come up with completely different numbers, and you make a set of assumptions that looks reasonable, and somebody else makes another set of assumptions that looks equally reasonable, and you end up seeing very different pictures. And you got to talk about depreciation, which is just is a completely, and again, the mainstream is 100% every bit as bad on this. Measures, it's actually kind of hilarious how, if you look at a measure of the capital stock published by the IMF or the Penworld tables or whatever, and you start digging in and you figure out where these numbers come from, it's absolutely, it's hilarious how completely made up they are. So I'm not saying that this is a specific problem with Marxists, although it's maybe a more urgent problem for a certain strand of Marxism because of the greater emphasis put on the profit rate defined in this way. But I think that there's absolutely no consistent way of measuring the capital stock, and there's a lot of plausible things you might do that will not give you even broadly consistent answers. So I think you have to, if you need that number to answer your question, you need to find a different question.
That's a really good way of putting it. I've compared it to the gender pay gap, right? Like, so you and I both deal with data quite a lot. I have yet to find a data set where the gender pay gap doesn't jump out at me. Like, it's just there. It doesn't matter if it's earnings. It doesn't matter if it's income. You know what I mean? Like, it's just always there. It doesn't matter if you adjust, contrary to what Jordan Peterson says. It doesn't matter if you adjust for occupation. There is still something there. I haven't seen a data set without it. So we can say that is a robust feature of contemporary capitalism. With the rate of profit, it can go. I've not found a data set where it really, really, really rapidly rises, but I've found a lot of volatility, some rises, some declines. And also, one of the things that bothers me, you're sort of being quite diplomatic in not mentioning people directly, but I find a lot of the authors who advertise the falling rate of profit as they're not that public about their data, and I would like to look at that data and see how they got there, not necessarily to debunk them, just to see why have you got a different answer to me. But sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes I feel like it's a bit of a black box. And with all these what we call researcher degrees of freedom, right, in how you measure capital, how you measure the rate of profit, we know you know, as people who deal with data, that is a recipe for bias and disaster, really. That many
Yeah.
researcher degrees of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I have a strict policy in conversations like this. I only am going to mention somebody's name or a book if I want you to go out and read it. But you know, but I think your critique is valid.
So the elephant in the room here is the labor theory of value, right? Now, when I hear someone like you, or someone like David Harvey, or someone like the guy we were just discussing, James Crotty, use Marxism to interpret and discuss crises of capitalism, I'm pretty much always compelled by the explanation. I think whatever Marxism is, it seems to give you a lens into those crises better than almost any other school of thought. Maybe Keynesianism is as good, but that's also heavily influenced by Marxism, as we've discussed. So I find it really compelling. What I find less compelling is the idea that all of this is somehow evidence of the labor theory of value. Because I think that even if you do think the rate of profit falls, it's not necessarily the case that it falls for reasons to do with the labor theory of value. And then, as we've discussed, it's difficult to ascertain whether it's falling at all. So, I mean, what's your position on the labor theory of value? How do you view it?
Well, I guess there are a couple ways of looking at it. One way that I've always been drawn to, but I'm not sure if you had my back to the wall, I could fully defend, is that, you know, we need to think of Marx as doing an immanent critique. He is critiquing the system he lives in from within that system. And, you know, the subtitle of Capital is a contribution to the critique of political economy. So the book is a critique. That's right there in the title of the book. And so he is writing within the language and the paradigm of the best economics of his time, in order to show that even if you accept their assumptions and view of the world, you still have a system that is fundamentally unjust and fundamentally unsustainable. And so the economics of his time embodies the labor theory of value. It says that, you know, ultimately, you know, the only scarce resource is human labor, and things are priced at cost. And so the cost of any commodity is going to gravitate to being proportionate to the amount of labor that was required to produce it. And that's not an original idea with Marx. It was, you know, he's taking it directly from Ricardo. And so he's not in that using that to make a positive claim about the world. He's using that to show, even if you think Ricardo is right in his assumptions, that still is consistent with this radical critique that points us towards the need for a different form of production, that points us towards the need for a political movement that is going to bring us towards socialism. So I find that view appealing. I think there's definitely some truth to it. I mean, it is true that he is writing a critique of political economy. It is true that he is trying to use the tools of the contemporary economics profession as it was coming into being to justify a very different political program than they supported. And I think it is valid to some substantial part to read the labor theory of value in that way, to say that, you know, the fact that we have a system that you don't need, and this is actually very important because it says you don't, this is against, you know, Proudhon and some of those people who wanted to say essentially that the problems with capitalism is the way that it sort of departed from an idealized market system, the way that it departed from the labor theory of value. The idea that there was sort of monopolies and artificial restraints on trade that caused the price of some commodities to be inflated and others to be depreciated, and it was these sort of artificial monopolies and restraints that had to be removed, and that a sort of perfected market system would in fact be an egalitarian system and deliver a lot of the goals that socialists had, you know, in this sense, you know, an anticipator of a lot of today's market socialism. And so Marx is saying, no, you don't need any sort of special monopolies or restraints or sort of political power beyond that required to establish commodities and wage labor in the first place. You know, once the state has carried out, you know, the task of original accumulation and dispossessed people from the means of production, you can leave the rest to the markets, and the markets can function as advertised, as their advocates say, and you still can see a system that is radically unfair by our sort of substantive moral sense. It's inegalitarian, and that has this concentration of wealth and income, that has profits accumulating in the hands of a few capitalists. So I think in that sense, there's a lot of ways in which that's how the labor theory of value is functioning for him, as something he's going to spot to the other side. He's going to say, I'm giving you your labor theory of value, and look, my arguments still follow. So if you see it that way, you shouldn't necessarily be, and then of course, the mainstream moves on and sort of wants to do a 180, and instead of treating, everything is coming from production now, costs and values all come from utility and the desirability of the commodities, and then later we try to get some sort of balancing between them. So, and sort of treat labor as just one of many potentially inputs into production. I don't know, there's lots of different ways, but you don't have a mainstream that is committed to the labor theory of value in the way that Ricardo was. So in that sense, you could say that, the legacy of Marx should be the parts of Marx that we would still want to deploy in response to the mainstream economics of our time, and not the things that were there sort of rhetorically as a way of engaging with the economics of his time. And then we can kind of jettison the labor theory of value with a clean conscience. So I think you can. I think that is a defensible position. I'm not sure that you can completely. I'm not sure you can go all the way with that. I think that there's too many ways in which Marx actually was really trying to positively make use of this concept in his own analysis to say it is just a sort of rhetorical concession to the mainstream. I mean, I would like to argue it that way because it would let us avoid some of these debates. But a second point of view you could have is that there is a real truth in which part of the development of capitalism as a system is an increasing convergence towards something like a labor theory of value. We mentioned this a little earlier, but it's the existence of proletarianized labor that makes a quantity of labor meaningful. The only way you can talk about an hour of labor as a sort of homogeneous quantity that you can compare and ask how much of it is embodied in a given commodity is if one person's labor is just the same as another's. So that the proletarianization that turns all labor into this equivalent unskilled labor means that we now can talk about a quantity of labor embodied in a commodity in a way that we would not be able to in a world where production was organized in a different way. If your labor emerges, your capacity for work, your labor power emerges from all of your social settings, all your relationships and everything else that defines who you are, then your labor power is not really comparable in any straightforward way to somebody else's, and it doesn't make any sense to talk about a quantity of it. So, it's this world of proletarianized labor where people have been separated from the means of production and where production has been separated from the rest of social life that starts making this notion of a quantity of labor meaningful. And then also on the other side, where you have production for profit. So you really have this, and where the access to the means of production for the capitalists themselves depends on their ability to consistently generate a surplus. You don't have landlords anymore whose access to the means of production is just based on who they are, their social position. Means of production have to be acquired in the market like everything else. And that means the only people who have access to the means of production are the ones who have succeeded in generating a surplus through their control of production processes in the past. And this creates this enormous pressure to find ways of producing more with less labor. And so again, then that imposes a uniformity on the production process that would not otherwise exist, because labor can only be used where it can produce more value than if it were used somewhere else. And you only are going to hire labor in a situation where you can actually generate the most surplus out of it. And so you have a uniformity on the one hand of labor power because of proletarianization, on the other hand of the production process because of this pressure towards maximizing the surplus. And again, the result of that, and then you have everything trading in a market. So you have a uniform price for the products because everything is traded in this market. So that creates a situation where you actually do have a pressure towards things trading, towards prices being proportional to labor power, because and of course, other sort of non-human inputs kind of disappear. They become less relevant. The natural capacities of the soil become less relevant in a world where you have industrial production, where you have scientific agriculture and so on. So you have a world where, labor is uniform, labor is the only input, and the production process is kind of forced towards the one best way of doing things. And then that creates a situation where something like the labor theory of value actually is going to hold as an approximation. So I think, again, we could say that, and I think maybe David Harvey would say some of those things too. So that again says there's a real value in this, not again as just a flat claim that this is factually the case, but it's identifying one of the central tendencies under capitalism. something that's realized imperfectly, and we obviously can point to steps away from that as well as towards that. Labor is proletarianized; it's also deproletarianized at many times. Through the training and education, especially when it's delivered by the state, and credentials and so on, that actually make people's labor less exchangeable, and monopolies and other restraints on trade actually do exist, and so. We can go back and forth, but certainly as identifying a very powerful central tendency that tends to push prices towards some kind of proportionate relationship with labor power. I think I think there's something important that is there. But again, you wouldn't want to say that this is actually factually the case about the world. You would say this is a tendency that may be more or less fully realized at different times. The third way is to actually say this is the case and try to sort of mathematically show how you can analyze the amount of labor embodied in commodities and come up with some numbers that are different from what we see when we just measure things by their price. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's a little bit of a dead end. And again, maybe that in some people's minds means I'm not a Marxist. I don't care particularly, but I suppose I have to acknowledge there's a difference there. That book by Sheikh and Tonak from years ago, Measuring the Wealth of Nations, where they tried to do it. I don't know how many people still do this. I think it's a problem. And I guess we should say one sort of fundamental obstacle is, the Schraffa problem, Piero Schraffa, who just showed that you can't, there's still, even if the only source of value is labor, we still have labor applied at different times. We still have labor that is labor power being used in the present, labor power that's already embodied in means of production. And you can't derive the proper relationship of those two things. You can't say what is the quantitative relationship between labor power that was, used in the past and labor power being used today. You need something like an interest rate or a discount rate or a profit rate, and you need that as a parameter before you can derive all your relative prices. So that suggests that we're never going to have a logically consistent, pure labor theory of value. You're going to need, coming from somewhere else, this parameter that relates, current labor power to labor power that is already embodied in means of production in order to get an overall quantity of labor power embodied in the commodity. I mean, there's a very, people, you can get sucked into these debates and spend your whole life, and they're intellectually fascinating. But to me, I think Schraffa's critique is kind of decisive here.
Yeah, I think so. At least, for claims about using labor to predict prices, certainly I feel like that Schraffa was.
Yeah, really, I mean, it's in a way, Schraffa is sort of saying the same thing. Minsky with his two-price system is saying, the object of the critique, that you can't abstract away from the financing side of the economy, if you like, or maybe you want to call it a distributional variable instead. But there's some additional thing that you need to know there. The trade-off between production today and creating the conditions for production tomorrow is not a trade-off that you can make in terms of the same factors of sort of just the same pressures that influence the trade-off between different forms of production today. That there's an additional variable that comes into play there.
G.A. Cohen also has quite an interesting paper where he uses what you've just said, as well, among other points, to critique the idea that the labor theory of value implies that labor is exploited. I think because of this differential introduced by time, essentially, is one of his main points. I don't know how familiar you are with that paper.
Yeah, I don't think that's. I don't know. Some people find that compelling.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to know that labor, I think if you want to understand that labor is exploited, you should look at the workplace, you should look at production, you should look at the fact that you have people who are actually carrying out the productive activity and then somebody else who's just claiming the surplus at the end of that process. And if you want to also then ask how production is actually organized in a way that is in the interest of the ability to get a surplus from it and not the ability to carry out the process itself. And then, I think if you're really coming to Marx in I want to almost say an authentic way, that's probably where you're coming from. But what Marx is then trying to do is to show you that is compatible, is consistent with this model of exchange at market prices that you're learning about from the economists. but you don't come to believe that there's exploitation because of the economist model.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think often, the ancillary assumptions that you get, for example, the idea that laborers need to work to survive, whereas capitalists have access to capital, right? That power asymmetry. Often, and it depends on who you ask again, but often I find those play quite a big role in the Marxist argument for exploitation. And then I sort of feel like, well, that insight for me is fine by itself. You know what I mean? Like the asymmetry between labor and capital, and you don't necessarily have to add everything else. I don't know if I mean,
Yeah, you
people have
start
different
with the
opinions on
fact that
this.
you hate your job. You start with the humiliation and the boredom and the frustration of having to go to work and the knowledge that you have to do it. Nobody's holding a gun to your head, but they might as well be, because you
Yeah.
will be kicked out of your house. You'll be evicted. You won't have money for groceries unless you go in there and you sell yourself and you experience it. I can't make choices. I can't do the things I would like to do. I have to act like an automaton. I have to take somebody else's will in place of my own. And that's what I have to do if I want to be able to survive. And you also see, looking around you, this isn't necessary to do the work. In fact, I could probably do this job better. I can see all sorts of ways in which I could do it better, but I don't have the freedom to do that. This is not just about getting the job done. This is about my subordination to somebody else. I think that's the core of it, I think, and I certainly find, as a teacher, if students have a response to Marx in the classroom, and, I think in some ways you don't want necessarily to be reaching people in that way in the classroom. Like, people's politics should come from somewhere else. That's not your job as a teacher. But to the extent that people have that reaction to Marx, it's because of that connection to their experiences at work. So I think that trying to sort of derive exploitation from prices, even if you felt like there was a logically consistent way to do it, would be sort of a pointless exercise.
Yeah, that's really, really well put. Josh, I mean, I could talk to you probably for 2 hours about inflation, which you mentioned before, and the current cost of living crisis. But I think we've been speaking for 2 hours. We have 350 people watching live, by the way. Are you able to maybe do 10 minutes of Q&A? Because people have been asking quite a lot of questions in the chat.
Sure, you'll pass the questions on.
I can relay them. I mean,
yeah.
you could open up my YouTube and go on it and see them with a slight delay, or I can just relay them to you. I'll just relay them to you.
There we are. I actually hadn't looked at this before. I didn't even know what you looked like. There we are.
Yeah, you can't see me. Discord's not letting you see me. So
yeah. Why don't you pick? I think it will be smoother if you pick some questions.
That's fine. Well, the first question. So G. Russell asks, how does the solo growth model square with your view of capital and long-term thinking?
Right. I mean, this is the whole thing. Piketty is basically using the solo growth model, except that he says, you don't have to you can have positive return, so the return to capital doesn't fall as you get more of it. But the basic structure is the solo growth model with that tweak. The problem here is that you're treating capital as a physical quantity. That this is the essential hardware for the solo growth model, is that the quantity of capital at T1 is equal to investment at T0 plus, or the capital stock at T0 plus the investment at T1 minus the depreciation rate times the stock of capital. So at T0. So you've got a physical notion of capital where it's a water in the bathtub. Investment pours more water in. Some of it's always leaking out through depreciation, and that tells you how high the bathtub is going to be. And, again, people have the Schraffa critique I mentioned a little earlier, that you can't actually create a consistent physical quantity of capital because you already have to know the distribution of income between capital and labor before you can even calculate the quantity of capital. As a logical critique is fine, but you don't need the logical critique because historically the capital stock doesn't behave like that at all if we measure it in terms of money. And we only can't measure it in terms of money. It's the only way we can measure it. And if we measure it in terms of money, most of its shifts up and down have nothing to do with the flows that we observe. So to me, that just means that so whether it's logically consistent or not, the solo growth model is irrelevant to understanding the dynamics of real economies. Obviously, in addition, you've got some notion of utility that's coming in there from a representative household choosing how much consumption you want in the present and the future, which is also completely irrelevant to real economies. But I think, yes, I think one thing we absolutely need to do is just completely throw out the solo growth model and all of its derivatives.
I'm not just being flippant here, but it does strike me that the solo growth model, if it's relevant at all, is probably more relevant for something like the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, I think now the solo growth model. It was a development of a model by Frank Ramsey, this brilliant um, young mathematician, part of Keynes's Cambridge Circle, who died quite young. But my understanding is that the problem that he was trying to solve was precisely how he was, I believe, a communist or certainly a sympathizer. I think he might have been a party member. Anyway, don't quote me on that because I could be wrong. But certainly well on the left politically in a period where that meant you were sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And I believe the problem that he was trying to solve was precisely how a planner in a centrally planned economy should allocate output between current consumption and investment, which is the place where it comes closest to making sense.
Exactly. BB asks, can a society of worker co-ops meaningfully exploit labor if they maintain market exchange?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think that's the helpful way of asking the question. I think that we shouldn't be imagining blueprints of a completely transformed economy. We should be thinking about our direction of travel. We need a general direction. We need to know which way we want to go to. But when it comes to the specifics, we got to just put one foot in front of another. So, you can ask a lot of interesting questions about how worker co-ops operate in the world we live in and the constraints they are under, and whether there's a useful political project of extending co-ops and where that would be. I think those are all interesting questions. I think the abstract question of whether you could have, in some sense, exploitation in a world like that, I'm sorry, to me, it's not a productive question.
Yeah,
I mean, look, you got to ask, what's the experience of getting up in the morning and going to work in that society? Write a novel about it, or a short story, and then I think maybe you'll have some clarity. But don't try to answer it, formally.
So, Bad Boy 69 Jr. honestly asks, what do you think of analytical Marxism, especially John Romer's property relations-based theory of exploitation? This is very specific, and his updated coupon market socialist proposal.
I mean, it's Proudhon. It's just Proudhon. 150 years later, or whatever. I don't think we've made any. I think this is what Marx is writing to critique. I don't think they've made any forward progress since then. I don't care for market socialism. I think that it really it's open to the critique that Marx made of Proudhon, which is what you guys are saying is that you will do all the same things that the capitalists say that they're already doing, except that you'll really do them. The logic of it, the role that it asks markets to play, the assumptions it makes in order to get from that to some sort of just and appealing society are the same ones that the mainstream makes for markets. The only difference is it's a difference of saying, yes, but we'll really do it. It will really happen with us, So I don't really, I think we can move on from John Romer.
Okay. So someone asks if do you have any good reading on the relationship between economic growth and capital accumulation?
That's a really interesting question. I think we should, again, I'm going to say, I think if you're interested in the question of economic growth, you should read concrete historical accounts of economic growth. I think Schumpeter always is worth reading. I think one could go back and read his book on business cycles. I think there's an enormous amount of rich and interesting stuff in there. But I think the best thing to read is real concrete historical stuff. Whether it's if you're interested in the industrial, late industrial revolution period, you could read Chandler's Visible Hands, or you could read books on development, like Alice Amsden's, Asia's Next Giant about Korea, or one of the classic books about Japanese industrialization, like Chalmers Johnson. I think that this is a question that you will learn much more about if you read a concrete historical account of a particular outstanding episode of economic growth than a kind of abstract theoretical account.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Robert Allen, someone as well. Sorry, I was actually replying to a different question, so I'm not sure if you mentioned him. But a lot of people like Robert Allen's work, and I think it's very interesting. Often quite, idiosyncratic in its conclusions, I find, and really data driven. And I think that's often really interesting on whether it's Soviet growth or the Industrial Revolution in England. I don't know what you think of Robert Allen.
Yeah, no, I think that's also very good. Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing you should be looking for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is quite a broad question. Let's see. So somebody asked what you thought about the green transition, and I linked them to your co-authored Roosevelt Institute report on the New Deal.
I've actually got another one on that topic, which is probably more relevant here, which is I did it for this Zoe, the Institute for Future Fit Economics in Germany, I think it's called a Keynesian Perspective on Decarbonization or something. Let me see if I can find that, and I will put it in the chat.
I've got it. I did read that as well, actually. Climate policy from a Keynesian perspective or a Keynesian point of view.
I mean, I say Keynesian perspective. To me, I'm always looking for where you can draw on Keynes, where you can draw on Marx, and I think if you read the conclusion of that, it probably owes more to Marx than to Keynes. That the sort of final thoughts of that piece. But yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental issue for me is that it's wrong to think about this in terms of a sort of absolute scarcity or trade-off where we have to devote more resources to, climate ends and therefore we have less available for everything else, or we simply have to grow more slowly. I think that there are enormous untapped opportunities to greatly reduce our carbon emissions and other climate impacts. I think, we see this already with things like solar and wind power, especially wind, where the cost, once you have that initial public investment incentives to start the investment ball rolling, the costs come down drastically, so there's lots of areas, or, things like where you change, the pattern of urban development, you have denser cities. That's not a trade-off. Many people want to live in dense cities. That's why housing prices are so high. So, it's not a question of just like we need less stuff or we need less non-carbon stuff. But, in fact, any kind of transformation of the economy is going to be experienced as an economic boom. It's going to require labor. It's going to require spending money. The problems, from my point of view, the real fundamental obstacles are, one, coordination, because markets actually are okay for sort of small scale changes at the margins, but are very poor tools when you have to rapidly reorganize production on a larger scale, when you have to reallocate a lot of resources very quickly. And that's why, whether you're talking about, development, industrialization, or wartime mobilizations, you always see a much larger role for the state. You often see a much expanded role for, in some cases, financial institutions as planners as well. So the one problem is coordination. You got to do a lot of stuff simultaneously. Private incentives and markets are not good for that. And two, and I think this is, maybe the thing that people really don't see, but I think is really critical, is that precisely because rapid decarbonization will be experienced as a boom, it's going to be very favorable for labor, which sounds, great if you're, have the politics that probably most people watching this have, but is very threatening in terms of the broader, set of, broader income distribution society to labor and potentially to other particular groups as well. And so that distributional conflict is I think, a much more acute constraint than, real resources, and we didn't, today get into the inflation question. Maybe we can have another conversation at some point. But I think, today we're seeing very clearly how a rapid, a strong demand, conditions of strong aggregate demand that lead to rising wages and a downward redistribution of income, which we've absolutely seen over the past couple of years, is perceived as extremely politically threatening and brings forth a very strong response from kind of the guardians of orthodox economic policy. And so I think, long before you hit any sort of real resource constraint in any aggregate sense, you're going to have a situation where rapid wage increases are perceived as politically, intolerable by the people who actually get to set macroeconomic policy. And those are really the problems you have to be thinking about, the coordination question and the distributional question, as opposed to any sort of absolute resource constraints. And incidentally, I should add that I don't think, like, the framework of analytic Marxism, although I think Marx himself, I think, has an enormous amount to contribute on both those questions. I don't think the framework of analytic Marxism has much of anything. It basically assumes that both of those problems are already solved through market coordination.
Yeah, yeah. People are saying they'd really like to hear us talk about inflation. I'd like to as well. Not today though. It's been
Yeah.
2 hours.
No, but we
Yeah,
could. Well, I'd be happy to schedule another one of these when at
yeah.
some point.
That'd be great. So I think one other question which come through. So there's a bit of a challenge to you in the comments, Josh. I think people are saying, you're kind of saying you're against market socialism, but you also seem like a bit of a pragmatist. Is market socialism not quite a pragmatic first step? Well, I mean, it would be, a
Well,
12th step
I
or
think if
something that
you
we could
read
take.
market socialists, they're often imagining a world that is a much more marketized economy than the one we actually live in.
Mm,
This is something I sort of said in passing early on, but I think people don't always recognize how profoundly socialized the economy we live in already is. And one of the very important ways is the extent at which we have essentially giant islands of planning, separated by narrow little straits of markets in the real economy we have. Because industrial enterprises, business enterprises, capitalist enterprises are themselves internally planned. They are not market economies. There's a handful of ideological, hedge fund guys may try to organize their companies internally as markets, before they wreck them. But the way production is organized is somebody makes a decision about what's going to happen, and they give orders, and they have some sort of careful planning about what is going to be where and when and who is going to do things. And the whole thing operates, of course, in a hierarchical top-down manner, which we don't want for socialism, but in a deliberately, consciously planned and administered way, which we do expect, is what we'll see under socialism. So we already live, and then of course we have huge swaths of the economy that are managed by the state. The basic function of the central bank in setting interest rates is a huge exercise in planning, but there are many, many other areas. So, to imagine an economy that is completely marketized, but still has some of the socialist characteristics that we want, is not a pragmatic vision. It is a radical utopian vision for the extension of markets to many, many areas of life where they don't currently operate. And it's abandoning all of the many non-market ways we've already found to solve our collective problems, democratize the economy incrementally, whether that's environmental regulation and minimum wages, taxes, progressive taxes, and so on, or whether it's worker power in the workplace, whether it's all sorts of direct public provision of goods. We have a socialized education system, we have socialized fire and police protection, we have largely socialized water provision. That depends a bit where you are, but in the U.S. and most other advanced countries, a lot of public services are already provided through the public sector. So the notion that we need to pragmatically abandon all of that and have this, wall-to-wall market vision, I think to me that's pure idealistic utopianism. I think if you want to be a pragmatist, look for the examples where we already have collective provision and build on them and try to argue for them, generalize the case. I think rather than having this exercise in market socialism, I would like to say, we have public education. People value it. It's very important. It's the biggest group of, public sector workers in most countries. And it's something where people have an attachment to it. And it's also something where you've actually, certainly in the US, but in other countries as well, seen a fair amount of labor, militants. We should be generalizing from that. We should be asking the question, why is this something that the public does better than private businesses and markets? And why does it do it better, in particular, by giving people a professional identity and a degree of job security and civil service protections and so on? Why does this stuff work? Why do people value it? And how can we generalize it to other areas where we're not currently doing it? To me, if you want to be a pragmatist and step forward from where we are, you should step forward from those forms of socialism that already exist in the world, and not from some sort of abstract vision of markets everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess a lot of the market socialists I know would probably agree with you in the sense that they like public sector services. But I think there's, clearly a whole contingent of maybe more academic market socialists out there who are really, even more pro-market than capitalists, right? Is that the kind of thing you're addressing?
That's absolutely right. And there's also people who just haven't, their abstract theory is not connecting to their concrete politics. So they think, oh, public schools are great, public services are great, let's have more of those. And then they write down their political vision that has no place for that stuff. Yeah. It's a disconnect. And this is, honestly, maybe this, if you're an intellectual of some kind with some kind of politics, if you're doing theory, but you're also engaged with the world, you always need to be thinking about this gap. You always need to be thinking about these connections. You need to think about how does your theory respond to and how is it shaped by the actual concrete struggles that you're engaged in right now. And if we want to talk about the non-rubbish bits of Marx, I mean, that's the least rubbish thing about him, is that he was always asking this question, your theory has to respond to and be shaped to the concrete political activity that you're engaged in, the concrete problems that the world is throwing up for you. And of course, conversely, but in some ways, if you're an intellectual, this is the easy part. Your political engagement should be shaped by your theory. They need to be consistent and they need to be in conversation with each other.
That seems like a really good place to finish, Josh. I'll let you get on with your day. Thank you so much. This has been a really fantastic conversation, and I hope we'll talk again sometime before too long.
Yes, thanks. Well, sure. Let's at some point let's reconvene, because I enjoyed this conversation as well.
Yeah, me too. See you later. All right. Yeah. So that was about as fantastic as I thought it would be. Obviously, I didn't ask him about inflation. I would recommend going on Josh's blog, Josh Mason blog. What's it called? Oh, it's called jwmason.org. Like, if you want his thoughts on inflation or anything, just search Marx on there. Fucking honestly, Josh's opinions on all things, I basically just he's one of those people like Adam Tooze, or Adam Tooze is another good example, or Matt Brunig is another good example. Like, generally, if he writes something, I'll just agree with it. But yeah, thanks everyone. It's been a very big audience, and I hope it seems like you all enjoyed it. So yeah, somebody was saying live YouTube and not live YouTube are different now. That would be amazing if this didn't hurt the algorithm, but because I am a slave to the algorithm, I'm going to unlist this, download it, upload it to Unlearning Economics Live. In the future, I'll look at if I can keep these live conversations on the main channel, because obviously that would be great and would increase their views massively. But yeah, anyway, for now, I'm going to go and eat the lasagna that I made earlier. And have a nice day / evening, everyone.